Et je crois qu'on est allé dîner quelque part. Ouais, c'était bien. Et Hostile, je vais vous dire exactement ce qu'on a fait à leur relation.
For more than a decade, one name kept surfacing whenever Vatican watchers speculated about who might one day lead the Catholic Church after Pope Francis, Luis Antonio Tagle. He was the cardinal from Manila, with the easy smile and the reputation for speaking directly to ordinary people. The man some called Asia's Francis, long before anyone knew how the story of Francis's papacy would actually end. That story ended on April 21st, 2025, when Pope Francis died at the age of 88, closing out 12 years at the head of the world's 1.4 billion Catholics. What followed was one of the most closely watched successions in modern church history, a conclave that drew in cardinals from more than 70 countries, many of them appointed by Francis himself, tasked with choosing the 267th pope. Tagle was one of the men many expected might get the job. He didn't. This is the story of why he mattered anyway, what his path through the Vatican says about the church Francis tried to build, and how the actual conclave played out compared to what everyone predicted. Luis Antonio Goquiam Tagle was born in Manila in 1957 into a Philippines that was still, in many ways, defining its own post-war Catholic identity. By most accounts of his early life, he grew up grounded in an ordinary parish community rather than any kind of ecclesiastical elite, and it was there, immersed in the daily texture of Filipino Catholic life, that he first developed the instincts that would define his later ministry: an ease with regular people, a comfort with poverty rather than a distance from it, and an intellectual seriousness about theology that eventually carried him into formal religious study. He was ordained a priest and steadily built a reputation as a scholar as much as a pastor, teaching theology and taking part in international church commissions well before most Filipino clergy of his generation had a national, let alone international, profile. That combination theological credibility, paired with an unmistakably pastoral, ground-level sensibility, became the through line of his entire career. It's part of why, decades later, Vatican analysts kept returning to his name whenever they discussed the qualities the next pope might need. Tagle's rise accelerated in 2011 when he was named Archbishop of Manila, taking charge of one of the largest and most complex Catholic dioceses on earth. It was, by any measure, an enormous administrative and spiritual responsibility, and Tagle used the position to establish himself early as a reformist rather than a caretaker. He pushed back publicly against some of the trappings of institutional privilege that had defined the tenures of certain predecessors, prioritizing visible closeness to ordinary Filipino Catholics over the more formal, distant model of church leadership that had often prevailed in the archdiocese. His preaching style became something of a signature. Where a lot of senior Catholic clergy leaned on doctrinal formality, Tagle built sermons around plain language and lived experience stories that ordinary parishioners could recognize in their own lives, delivered with a warmth that made him popular well beyond the borders of his own archdiocese. Overseas Filipino workers. A huge and often overlooked constituency within the global Filipino Catholic community took particular notice of his appointment and his subsequent style of leadership, seeing in him someone who understood the strain and dislocation of migrant labor in a way more traditional clerical figures often didn't. That reputation was tested and ultimately reinforced in November 2013. When Typhoon Haiyan devastated large parts of the Philippines, killing thousands and displacing millions more. Tagle's response was immediate and hands-on, organizing relief efforts, appearing directly in devastated communities, and speaking about the disaster in unusually personal and emotional terms rather than the more clinical language often used by church institutions during crises. It was, in a sense, a live demonstration of the kind of Church of Mercy Francis had been describing in the abstract since the earliest days of his own papacy, and it cemented Tagle's national and international reputation as a leader who showed up rather than one who merely issued statements. Before his most consequential Vatican appointment, Tegel spent years as president of Caritas Internationalis, the global confederation of Catholic charity and relief organizations operating in roughly 165 countries. In that role, he worked on international campaigns addressing poverty, hunger, and increasingly, as the years went on, climate change, which he and other church figures increasingly framed not as a scientific or political debate, but as a matter of basic justice toward the world's poorest communities, who tend to suffer the most immediate and severe consequences of a warming climate. Tegel talked often, in this period, about a particular philosophy of church leadership built around listening rather than instructing. He argued, in various public remarks over the years, that a church leader's first obligation is to actually hear the people at the margins of religious and economic life, rather than assume their needs from a position of institutional authority. That emphasis dialogue over doctrine, presence over pronouncement, echoed almost precisely the language Francis had used to describe his own hopes for where the Catholic Church needed to go. It's a big part of why, when people started drawing direct comparisons between the two men, the label Asia's Francis stuck as quickly as it did. It's worth noting that this style didn't win Tegel universal admiration inside the Church. Critics in more traditionalist and conservative circles argued that an approach centered so heavily on social outreach and inclusive rhetoric risked de-emphasizing doctrinal clarity that meeting people where they are could, over time, shade into a kind of theological drift from long-settled Catholic teaching. Tegel and Francis both seemed to treat that criticism as an acceptable cost of the direction they had chosen, arguing repeatedly that a church unwilling to engage seriously with migration, poverty, and climate change risked making itself irrelevant to the world it existed to serve. In 2019, Francis named Tegel prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, a position sometimes informally referred to inside Vatican circles as the Red Pope, owing to the sweeping authority it carries over Catholic missionary activity across large parts of the globe. It's one of the most powerful roles in the entire Vatican bureaucracy, with particular influence over evangelization efforts in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, precisely the regions Francis had repeatedly identified throughout his papacy as central to Catholicism's long-term future, even as traditional Catholic strongholds in Europe and North America saw steady declines in both clergy numbers and general religious participation. The appointment placed Tegel at the literal operational center of the Church's effort to grow in exactly the parts of the world where Catholic membership was expanding fastest. It also reflected something specific about how Francis saw Tegel's value, not simply as a sympathetic, like-minded voice, but as someone with the administrative standing and cross-cultural credibility to actually execute a global strategy, not just articulate one from a pulpit. Tegel used the position to help reorganize aspects of the Church's evangelization approach in non-Western countries, drawing on his own background as a non-European churchman who had spent his entire career working directly with the populations Rome was trying to reach. If Tegel represented one instinct inside the College of Cardinals, Cardinal Pietro Parolin represented the other, and understanding the eventual conclave requires understanding both men. As Vatican Secretary of State, Parolin held one of the single most powerful administrative posts in the entire Church, overseeing its diplomatic relationships and the day-to-day machinery of Vatican governance. Where Tegel's public reputation was pastoral, emotionally direct, and reform-minded, Parolin's was built over decades on a very different set of skills: careful diplomacy, institutional patience, and a consensus-driven style suited to managing disagreements between rival factions rather than pushing hard in any single ideological direction. Parolin was widely described by Vatican analysts as a bridge builder, someone whose currency inside the Vatican bureaucracy came less from public charisma and more from his ability to negotiate among competing internal interests without alienating any one bloc permanently. That made him, in the eyes of many cardinals who preferred gradual change over dramatic reform, a reassuring figure, someone who could be trusted to preserve institutional continuity even while nominally continuing some of Francis's initiatives. The contrast between the two men, Tagle as the face of a more outward-facing, socially engaged Catholicism, Parolin as the embodiment of institutional steadiness and diplomatic caution, became the defining storyline of years of speculation about who might eventually succeed Francis. It also mapped onto a much older and more familiar tension inside Catholic Church politics: the pull between a more decentralized, globally distributed Catholicism, the kind Francis had spent his papacy trying to cultivate by elevating cardinals from dozens of countries that had never had one before, and a more traditional model in which European clergy, and Italian clergy in particular, retained outsized influence over the Vatican's actual levers of power. #Francis's final months and the path to a conclave. Francis's health had been a subject of serious public concern in the period leading up to his death, following a severe respiratory illness that had hospitalized him for an extended stretch. When he died on April 21, 2025, the Vatican moved into the formal, centuries-old process the Church uses to select a new pope, a process governed by rules first codified in the 20th century and updated since, but rooted in traditions that stretch back roughly 800 years to the origins of the conclave system itself. 16 days after Francis's death, on May 7, 2025, the conclave formally began, a gathering of the Church's cardinal electors, sequestered behind sealed doors inside the Sistine Chapel, sworn to secrecy, and tasked with reaching a two-thirds majority behind a single candidate before white smoke could rise from the chapel's chimney. The scale and composition of that gathering set it apart from any conclave in the Church's history. Of the roughly 250 cardinals worldwide at the time of Francis's death, 135 were under the age of 80 and therefore eligible to vote, the largest elector pool ever assembled for a papal conclave. Even more strikingly, roughly 80% of those electors had been personally elevated to the College of Cardinals by Francis himself over the course of his papacy, and they came from more than 70 different countries, in many cases representing the very first cardinal their nation had ever produced, whether by deliberate design or simply as a byproduct of 12 years of appointments. This was, by a wide margin, the most geographically and culturally diverse conclave ever convened, a direct institutional reflection of the global, outward-looking Church Francis had spent over a decade trying to build. Heading into the vote, Vatican watchers, journalists, and even informal prediction markets treated Tagle and Parolin as the two clearest frontrunners, alongside a handful of other widely discussed papabili: the Italian reformist Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, the Congolese Cardinal Fridolin Ambongo, the Hungarian Cardinal Tererd, and a few others whose names circulated in varying order depending on which analyst you asked. On the very day the eventual winner was announced, one prominent prediction market had shown Parolin holding the strongest odds among the field, with Tagle running a clear second and the rest of the papabili trailing meaningfully behind those two. #4 ballots, and a name few expected. The conclave did not take especially long by historical standards. An initial round of voting on the evening of May 7 produced black smoke, no decision reached. A second day of voting followed on May 8, with black smoke rising again after the morning session, indicating continued deadlock. Then, on the afternoon of May 8, white smoke finally appeared above the Sistine Chapel after 4 total ballots in all, making this one of the shorter conclaves in modern memory, comparable in length to the 2-day conclaves that had elected both Benedict XV in 2005 and Francis himself in 2013. The man the 133 cardinal electors ultimately chose was neither Tagle nor Parolin. It was Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, an American-born prelate who had spent a large portion of his ministry serving in Peru, and who at the time of his election held the position of prefect of the Vatican's dicastery for bishops. Prevost took the papal name Leo Civ, becoming both the first pope ever born in the United States and, through his many years of pastoral work in South America, a figure who, much like Tagle, carried deep personal and professional ties to the parts of the world where the Church's population is now growing fastest. For a succession widely framed in advance as a choice between institutional continuity and further change, the Cardinals ultimately settled on a figure that a fair number of outside analysts hadn't ranked among their top handful of contenders at all. It was a reminder one the Church has offered before, in conclave after conclave throughout its history, that the papabili discussed endlessly in the press coverage leading up to a vote don't always end up being the names that emerge from behind the Sistine Chapel's sealed doors. Hashtag, where that leaves Cardinal Tagel's failure to become Pope doesn't erase what his candidacy represented, nor does it end the role he's likely to keep playing at senior levels of the Church. He remains one of the most prominent non-European cardinals in the Vatican's leadership structure, and he continues to hold substantial influence over the Church's missionary and evangelization strategy across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the same regions that now make up the fastest-growing share of the global Catholic population, and the same regions Francis repeatedly identified as central to the Church's long-term survival and relevance. Tagle was also entrusted with real responsibilities during the transition period itself, assisting in the preparations that led up to the conclave alongside the Camerlengo, the Church official responsible for administering Vatican affairs during the vacancy between popes. That trust is itself a signal of his ongoing standing among his fellow cardinals, extending well beyond the speculative papal label the press had attached to him for years. The larger question his candidacy raised for the Church, whether its center of institutional gravity will keep shifting away from Europe and toward the regions where Catholic populations are actually growing, and whether its leadership will increasingly reflect that demographic reality rather than lag behind it, wasn't resolved simply because Tagle wasn't the one chosen. Leo Siv's own biography, split between his American origins and decades of pastoral ministry in Peru, suggests the Cardinals were still actively wrestling with exactly that tension when they cast their 4 rounds of ballots. They just answered it in a way that few outside observers had confidently predicted. What made Tagle such a compelling figure to Vatican watchers for so many years wasn't just his personal biography. Sympathetic as it is, it was what his candidacy represented about a genuine, unresolved argument happening inside the institution itself. On one side sat the instinct Francis spent his papacy trying to institutionalize, a church that measures its own success by how well it reaches the poor, the displaced, and the marginalized, willing to accept criticism from traditionalists as the price of staying relevant to a changing world. On the other side sat a competing instinct, represented most visibly by figures like Parolin, that prioritizes institutional stability, doctrinal continuity, and the slow, careful management of internal disagreement over rapid change in any direction. Neither instinct disappeared when the conclave ended. If anything, the composition of the electors overwhelmingly appointed by Francis, drawn from more countries than any conclave in history, yet still ultimately choosing a figure whose profile straddles both the outsider and institutional insider categories, suggests the Church